Hi, this is Robert SUNGENIS with you once again on the Open Question Program. This is August the 14th, 2019, and I hope to spend a little time with you. Today I'm going to set aside about an hour and a half, so we'll go from 7 o'clock to about 8:30 with your questions. If there are no questions, and of course I will close the program. But I want to invite you and your friends, relatives, countrymen to come to the program today, and let's talk about Catholicism, the Bible, theology, anything that is on your mind that you would like my personal opinion of. Now again, I stress personal opinion because I am, of course, not the magisterium of the church. I know the magisterium quite well, and I know the Bible quite well, and the tradition behind it. That's how I can help you. I can relate your question, whatever it is, to those three authorities that we have in the Catholic Church. To start off the program, I wanted to pick up from where we were about halfway through the program last Wednesday. Oh, and by the way, before I get into that, I just remembered, I've been thinking about how much I could dedicate my time to doing this. And I think to start out and make sure that we're on the right footing and that we get good participation and that everything works well together time-wise, logistical wise, because you have busy lives like I do, and it's hard to get everything done. But I think maybe what we can do right now is to have this 2 times a week, possibly Tuesdays and Wednesdays, or Tuesdays and Thursdays, or Wednesdays and Thursdays. That's what's running in my head right now. I have to do another program on the Principal Facebook page tomorrow, and that's just going to be once a week. This one I'm going to try to make at least twice a week. So I'm leaning toward Tuesdays and Wednesdays of the week, and then we'll see how it goes from there. Okay, so much for schedule. Let me see. There was a question last week that I wanted to touch upon because I hadn't thought about it at the time, but I just spent a few minutes looking at it before the program. And somebody asked a question about Hebrews chapter 10, verse 29. And they wanted to know what my interpretation of that was, as opposed to what James White. Now, I'm sure most of you know who James White is. He is a Reformed Baptist who is very anti-Catholic. And I just as a sidelight here, I've always told James I'm glad he is the way he is, because if it wasn't for him, I probably wouldn't have written Not by Faith Alone, and probably not by Scripture alone, and Not by Bread alone. So he has a worthy place in my mind as to the catalyst for the work that I've done in the past, since I've known him for 20 years, I think. No, actually longer than that, 24 years I've known James. And during that time, we have debated probably a dozen times, just off the top of my head, various topics stemming from, let me see, when did we first start debating? 1998, 99, something like that. Okay, so that's 20 years ago. And we've debated the Mass, we've debated purgatory, we've debated predestination versus free will. What else? The papacy. All the hot topics James and I have debated, and I really thank God for James, not because he's an anti-Catholic, but because he has spurred me on, so to speak, to dig deep into the Bible, dig deep into history, and there was no other way that I would have been motivated to do the work that I've done. So you can see God works in strange ways. You know, everybody considers James White their mortal enemy, who's Catholic, and I take a different take on that. I'd say he's the best gift God ever gave me. And so with that, he has an interpretation of Hebrews 10:29, where he says that, let me read that to you. I'll read from the Bible he's probably using, which is the King James Bible. I'm not sure. I know he uses the New American Standard sometimes, and maybe a few other translations, but I'll just read it from the King James. It says, how much sorer punishment, sorer means greater punishment, suppose you, shall he be thought worthy who hath trodden underfoot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant, wherewith he was sanctified, an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. Now, as you know, I think I explained a little bit of this last time, but the book of Hebrews, it's called Hebrews because it's written to Hebrews. And the Hebrews at this time, these were Hebrews, Jews, who had converted to Christianity. And things were going okay until the persecutions, the persecutions from Rome started to get hot and heavy. Starting in like the 60s through 65, they were the worst. And the Jews suddenly were becoming quite afraid of this Christianity they had adopted. They didn't know it was so lethal. And neither did the Christians, for that matter. Up until this time in history, they had not been persecuted like this. They had been persecuted by other Jews, as Paul went to preach the gospel. Every city he went to, there were Jews basically waiting for him. And they wanted to thwart the Christian gospel he was teaching. So after Paul was done, you know, they went in and gave the other side of the story, the Judaistic religion. And they weren't that successful, actually, but the fact is Paul considered them a thorn in his side, and that's why he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, for this thorn of the flesh, he calls it, to be removed, because he figures it would be so much easier to preach the gospel without the Jews in the way. And just like I said with James White, he's my Judaistic enemy, so to speak, okay? You know, it would be easy to say, well, Father, why can't you just get James White out of the way so that Catholicism can flourish? And just like Paul prayed 3 times, he says, to have this thorn in the flesh removed. Other people think the thorn in the flesh is something physical. With the context, I don't tend toward that direction. I think it was spiritual. I think it was the Judaizers, because he basically talks about them in almost every book that he's writing in one way or another. At any rate, God's answer to Paul was, my grace is sufficient for you. Don't worry about the enemies, even if it was physical, because I will work through that. And that's just the way God works. You know, he's very mysterious. But then, you know, at the end of the day, we see why he did that. Why did God keep James White in my life? And I just told you, because he motivated me to dig deep for the truth and defend Catholicism in a way that I never thought possible, because I knew it was right. I just had to find it and teach it. And see, we have the greatest advantage of being Catholics is we know we're right, okay? There can't be more than one church. So we know we have the truth because there's only one church, and ours started from the beginning. And basically, that's end of story. You could put a dot after that sentence and not say another thing, and you win. Because there's no church that can compete with the Catholic Church as far as longevity is concerned. And the fact that Jesus and the apostles spoke to the early church and gave them the doctrines that we all believe today. Nothing's ever changed. You know, it's just amazing. It's clear as day for people to see. And we all know there's other things that prohibit them from seeing. And the devil's working overtime to do that. But here we are, because of that, basically James White being a thorn in the flesh for me. I could have prayed until I was blue in the face and God would never remove him because he was the best thing for me. These Judaizers also were the best thing for Paul. What happened? You know, there's this old saying that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You see, because, you know, for all we know, they would have stayed in Jerusalem for decades upon decades, you know, because it's nice and comfortable to be around Christians and all live the same and not have any persecution. But then how would the gospel be spread? Okay. And since we are naturally, you know, got concupiscence and we're naturally lazy, and so we need something to move us. Okay. And there's nothing like being persecuted to move you out of a place that you're in. So that's what happened to the early church, this persecution in whatever form it came. And it first came from the Judaizers, at least up until 70 AD, was enough to motivate them to go out and preach to other cities. And Paul himself had 3 missionary journeys. The first one to Galatia, and then the others to the other epistles that he wrote. And then he even wrote some while he was in prison in Rome. And that's where he ended up. But, you know, and everywhere he went, as I said, the Jews followed him and tried to disrupt his gospel. So, long story short, what we want to understand here is that God works it all out. You know, we think in days, God thinks in centuries and thousands of years. As Peter says, one day is as 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is one day. And by the way, that doesn't mean that a day can be 1,000 years. You know, like if we read 1,000 years in the book of the Apocalypse, it doesn't mean it's one day. Okay, Peter is just using a metaphor to show us how the mind of God works, so we can, you know, get a handle on what he's doing and how he's doing it. So just be careful with that passage. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, if I remember correctly. So anyway, let's get back to Hebrews 10, and then I'll take some questions. Looks like we have some questions here. So the person who brought this up last week asked, I asked them, well, what is James White's interpretation of this passage? Because I don't think I've ever heard him talk about this passage. I know I've quoted it to him many times, and it was just sort of fluffed off. But because here's a passage talking to these Hebrews who were being tempted to leave the Christian faith because of the intense persecution. So that's good to know in the context, because when the writer of Hebrews comes in and then says, if you leave Christianity, here's what's going to happen. It's not like a lateral move you're going to make. You know, you're moving from one faith to the other and everything's going to be okay. He says, if you leave Christianity, he goes, you're going to have a much greater punishment because you trod underfoot the Son of God. You counted the covenant that you were sanctified in, past tense, sanctified. And you done harm to the Spirit of grace. Okay, so basically you've blasphemed the Trinity, is what he's trying to say, because he mentions God before that. So you have God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. That's the Trinity. And prior to that, he said they're all going to be witnesses against you. Now, it was one thing to have Moses' law as a witness against you, because he says, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word is established, or every crime is affirmed. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses to convict someone of a crime. And he says here, basically, in Hebrews, that the 3 witnesses are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit against you, okay? Because you've harmed each of them by leaving the Christian faith, okay? So this is a very serious context. So, despite the persecution, I'm sure the writer sympathized with them. But, he says, you got to hold on. And he says that that warning permeates the Hebrew epistle from chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then he gets into the priesthood in 7 and beyond. But even then, he sprinkles some of those later chapters with a warning not to fall away, not to fall away. Hold on until you receive your great eternal prize, because it's going to be something that you never even thought possible. It's going to be so good. Okay, so it's worth it. Anyway, I say all that to say this. The person wrote back to me that evening, last Wednesday, and said, James's interpretation is that the phrase, he was sanctified, refers to Jesus Christ. And I can see why James would say that. Because in James's view of his Reformed faith, he believes that we are being sanctified now in our Christian life. So the way it works for them is you're justified when you become a Christian, and that's a one-time thing, and then it's over with. It never happens again. And then after you're justified, then you are being sanctified. Okay? So when the writer here uses the aorist tense in the Greek, and that's the past tense, he says, by which you were sanctified, that means that the sanctification is considered as something done. You're sanctified. Okay? Now, as Catholics, we believe, yes, our justification and our sanctification increases as we go. But here, it's odd for James White, because sanctified is used in the past tense. So it can't really apply to the Christian, because James doesn't believe that sanctification is an aorist event. That is, it happened in the past, and it's not happening in the present and future. Okay, so it's an interesting tense that the Hebrew writer uses here. So I can see why James would want to get away from the idea that it refers to the Christian, because it says that the Christian, if he was sanctified, it also means he was justified, because in James's view, you can't be sanctified unless you're justified. So he has to have both the sanctification and the justification. All right. And yet, in spite of all that, the writer is saying that you can lose your salvation. Okay. So yeah, that would bother me if I was James, because sanctified is just in the wrong place in this chapter if we're going to go by the Reformed faith. Okay. Now it fits right in with Catholicism, because we were sanctified when we were baptized. All right? We were justified and sanctified when we were baptized. That's how important baptism is. But we can lose our justification and our sanctification. And that's what's going to happen to this person here in this verse. He'll lose his sanctification. And just as a reminder, I also want to throw this out because to this very day, since I've written Not by Faith Alone, I've never had a Protestant come up with a good answer to it. And as far as I know, Not by Faith Alone is the first book to, and I'm not, boasting, or patting myself on the back here. I'm just saying that it's very important, and I want you to know it in case you ever get into an argument with Protestants about justification, okay? And that comes from Romans chapter 4. And if you remember that chapter, Paul is talking about Abraham, number one, how he believed and God counted it as righteousness for him, and he was justified, okay? And that he's quoting from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. And then it talks about David. And it says, it quotes from Psalm 32. And David says, happy is the man, I forget the exact phrase, happy is the man whose sins are forgiven. And within that he says, and without works, okay? And so now this is rather interesting because Psalm 32 is the psalm where David is repenting of his sins of adultery with Bathsheba, who was Uriah the Hittite's wife, and then the eventual murder by David of Uriah to cover it up. Okay? That in itself is amazing because the Bible, God himself extols David above most men. There was only a few men that were better than David, according to God. Daniel, maybe, Noah, but David's right up there. And yet this fella committed adultery and murder within probably a week or two of each other. Okay, so he's on his way to hell. Those are mortal sins, deadly sins, and they take the life of the soul, and he's dead in sin. So what does he do? Well, Nathan the prophet comes to him, and David, he's still trying to cover things up, and Nathan gives him a little allegory about some man who stole other man's sheep, and that's all the man had was this one sheep. And Nathan says, what shall we do with that man who stole this little sheep from this one man, and that's all he had? And David says, kill him. And then Nathan says, thou art the man. Thou art the man. Wow. Can you imagine? Let's see. I mean, that's not a fairy tale. That actually happened. Okay? So you can imagine how David felt. Wow. Man, all this effort I put into getting out from under this crime. And I have this, this prophet pointing a finger at me. At any rate, so he repents of his sin. God forgives him. Now, the important thing is here that Paul, who's writing about this incident in Romans chapter 4, says that David was justified at that time without works. Yeah, we can understand that. David didn't do any works to God. He didn't do any sacrifices. He didn't call for the priests and say, I've sinned greatly, go offer a bull and goat for me and, see if God forgives me. No, he just repented of his sin and God forgave him. Okay, so, but the important thing is that Paul says at that time that he repented, he was justified. And no wonder David says in Romans 4, blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven, who his ungodly ways are discovered. Okay? So basically David is calling himself an ungodly man. And what's an ungodly man? someone who doesn't know God, someone who's on his way to hell, who's been cut off. He's ungodly. Yeah, and if you commit the sins of adultery and murder, you are certainly ungodly. Okay? So he's the ungodly man. He's the man that's not doing works in order to get his justification back. Now that's the key. You see, he got his justification back. All right? Which implies what? That he was justified prior to that. Yes, if you read Psalms 1 to 31, before Psalm 32, where he confessed his sin, what kind of man do we find David is? He's a man of God. Yeah, one of the best men of God. This is the guy that came from a family of 7 brothers. And in order to determine who was going to be the next king after Saul, Samuel says, well, bring all your sons, Jesse, in front of me, and I will pick the one that's going to be king. Because God does not look on the outside, God looks on the inside, at the heart of man. And so Jesse brings all his sons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And Jesse looks at Samuel and says, okay, which one is it? And Samuel says, sorry, not any of them. And this is funny. Then Samuel says, do you have any more sons? Yeah, I have one more son. He's out there in the field, but he's too young. And, these other ones that walk before you, look, they're strong, they're mighty, they're popular, they're this, they're that. No. So he gets young David, they go fetch him from the field. He's tending sheep, and they fetch him from the field, bring him to Samuel, and as he's walking the path down to meet them, Samuel says, behold, the king of Israel. Okay? That's how good David was. And God chose him through Samuel because, as he said, he chooses what's on the inside, in the heart. So we know this David had a great heart that pleased God. And there's many other passages in the Bible I could point to that God himself's coming down and saying, what a great man David is. At one point in the Chronicles, he said, he's great, yeah, except for that time he had adultery with Bathsheba and murdered Uriah the Hittite. Other than that, he was perfect, is what the Chronicles says. And the Chronicles, as opposed to Kings, has a more positive way of looking at the patriarchs, but at any rate, it's still the truth, okay? And that was God's looking. So we know this man was justified. If there wasn't anybody else justified, it was David, because of what the Bible says about him prior to his sin with Bathsheba and killing Uriah the Hittite. So this is a problem for anybody who's not Catholic. Why? Well, because according to their version of the Bible, you're only justified once. And once you're justified, you can't lose your justification. Another way to say it is once saved, always saved. Well, if that's the case, then why is David used as an example by Paul of someone who lost his justification because of his mortal sin, confessed his sin, and then God restored his justification? And he did it all without works. Now, the works we're talking about here are the works that are in context in Romans 4. We're not talking about the works that James talks about in James chapter 2. And that's, boy, if there's nothing else you get from Not by Faith Alone when you read it, it's this. Know the distinction between what kind of works Paul is talking about, or the Bible's talking about. Because in Romans 4, Paul's talking about works in the sense of us trying to put God in debt to pay us for work that we did. And the pay is heaven, salvation. Okay? The work is whatever we think the work is. It can be anything. And so our relationship with God is such that it's like an employer-employee relationship instead of father-son, where we do, as the employee, we do work for God, and then we expect God to pay us. As a matter of fact, not only do we expect him to pay us, legally he owes it to us. Okay? Excuse me. Take a sip of this liquid. I don't know how long my voice is going to last tonight. So last Wednesday, I think I lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes. I don't know why it happens, but it just happens. At any rate, where was I? With works, yes. Okay, very important. Very, very important. So we as Catholics can agree with the various Protestants who say that works can't save us. They can't, depending on how you view the works. Okay? If you're working to put God in debt, as a matter of fact, Paul uses the word debt in Romans 4:4. Because he says if you work, then it's a matter of debt. And what does that imply? This is where you have to sort of read between the lines to flesh out the picture that Paul is giving us. He's giving us an employee-employer relationship, okay? So if I work for IBM, let's say, and I put in my 40 hours of work, well, I am legally owed compensation for that, money. I signed a contract with them. They said they were going to pay me so many dollars for so much work, and it doesn't make a difference what our relationship is like. They could hate me for all they care. I could hate them. But the fact is, I put in the work, and they owe me legally, let's say, $1,000 for that work. They must pay. No choice about it. If they don't pay, then I can take them to court, another legal framework, and I can tell the judge, here's the contract, judge. Here's my time card of the 40 hours I spent working for them, and they refuse to pay me. And what's the judge going to do? He's going to tell them to pay. Not only that, I'll get punitive damages, maybe more than $1,000, maybe $2,000 I'll get. Okay, so the point is that they are legally obligated to pay, no questions asked. Is that the kind of relationship we have with God? No way, says Paul. No way. God owes nobody nothing. Okay? Nobody nothing. And there's a nice verse in Romans 11:36 that says that very thing. God owes nobody nothing. Okay? Anything we get from God must come from his voluntary favor for us. His grace, his graciousness, his benevolence. He is a benefactor. But we can't demand anything from him. And that was the Jews' problem. They were so enamored with themselves, and because we're the seed of Abraham, and we've been circumcised. And basically they were saying that God owed them salvation just because they were the seed of Abraham. Paul says, sorry, chum, you got it all wrong. And you had it all wrong from the beginning. And let me tell you a little story about Abraham. Was he saved because he was circumcised? That's how Paul goes on in Romans 4. No is the answer. You can read that in verses 9, 10, and 11. Okay? When was Abraham saved? He was saved before he was circumcised. You see? Genesis 15 is the passage Paul quotes from for his justification of Abraham. When was Abraham circumcised? Genesis 17, 2 chapters later. And I don't know how many years, but it was after. So basically, Paul's saying circumcision does nothing for you. Okay? It was just a sign that God had a relationship with Abraham. That's all it was. It was a sign. Had nothing to do with salvation. Nothing. Okay? So these are the object lessons that Paul is trying to give. But the big one for us Catholics against the Protestants is that David was justified at least twice. Okay? Once before Psalm 32, when he was the man of God that God esteemed so much and picked him as the king over his 7 brothers. Okay? That was the justified David. And then he committed these heinous sins of murder and adultery, and he lost his justification. And he had to be rejustified. Now, this is exactly what happens in confession. We have mortal sin on our soul. We're ungodly, basically. We're dead in sin. If we were to die at that moment, we go straight to hell. Okay? So what do? We go into the confessional, and this is basically the reason why confession was instituted, to take care of mortal sins. Because there's nothing you can do. You could cry out to God all you want, but God says you have to use the church as your vehicle when you commit mortal sin. If you commit venial sin, you can confess to God immediately. And I find myself doing that, 100 times a day. But if you commit mortal sin, you're in a totally different territory. You are lost, you are dead, you are ungodly, as Paul says in Romans 4. You have lost your justification, you have lost your sanctification. You're just as good as any unsaved person walking the street. The only advantage you have is that you're still a member of the church, and you can use the sacraments God has given you because you're baptized, and repent of that sin, and then take the penance that the priest gives you. And if he's a good priest, he's going to take it very seriously and give you a pretty harsh penance. If I were a priest and I heard that in confession, I feel sorry for you, buddy, because I'd give you a penance that probably lasts at least 5 years. That's how serious a matter it is. With that kind of penance, you're going to think twice about getting into mortal sin again. Okay? At any rate, this is important, as I said, because we see that the sacrament of confession is spoken of right in the very chapter that the Protestants try to use as their own verse of scripture to knock down the Catholic theology. All this talk they use about, well, you Catholics, you think you're saved by works and all this stuff. Well, right here it says, that the man is saved without works. Yeah, well, we've already got that covered because we know what kind of works Paul's talking about. Well, you got a bigger problem. Your problem is that the man who's doing it without works and getting his justification is David. Okay, that's a big problem for you. And if you can't answer that question, then your whole theology just collapsed like a house of cards. Okay? So what I have found since I wrote this, and not by faith alone, I did not read it in any father. I did not read it in any theology book. It just came to me one day that the very man Paul's talking about is David. And if that is true, these are the implications of it. And I just explained those to you. And if that is the case, then we have just obliterated the Protestant faith, because everything they think hinges on this passage, on this one passage. I mean, I've had, speaking of James White, I remember Eric Svensson, he's no longer around. Who else was it? Was it Matt Slick? Somebody else tried to answer this, at least the ones that try to answer it, okay? Most of them don't answer it. Like I posed this to Michael Horton, for example. 3 times I posed this to him, and 3 times he just ignored it like it wasn't there. Because he's smart enough to figure out that there is no answer to it if you're a Protestant. But James White and a couple of other guys, Slick, and there was a few more, said, well, Paul's not talking about David. That's the only thing I could come up with. Paul's not talking about David. Oh, really? Well, was he talking about Abraham in verse 1 when he used Abraham as an example? Yeah. All right. So he's talking about David. So why isn't David the very example that Paul wants to bring to the fore to show us how justification works? And suddenly you hear crickets. Okay. So what I have found in a lot of apologetics is it doesn't matter what kind of answer you give them, they're not going to change. If I was posed with that answer, I mean, I had to be honest with you. When I was searching, if someone gave me that answer when I was a Protestant many moons ago and said, David is the man who was rejustified, I would just be shaking in my boots, because I would know that there's no way out of that. There's just no way out of it. Okay? So this is what I've gotten in 20 years. I've never gotten an answer to this from a Protestant. They'll either say that David is not the man being talked about, or they'll just ignore it like I never posed the question to them. It's funny, but that's the experience I've had. So back to Hebrews 10:29, we can see why James wants to change the person who's sanctified here to Jesus, whatever that means. What does it mean to sanctify Jesus in the salvation sense? I mean, I think James doesn't realize what deep water he's gotten himself into here. Okay? Because sanctified is a definable term in the Greek, and there's probably one of those other passages he can't get out of. So he has to change the whole thing around and say it's not the Christian who was sanctified, it's Jesus. So at least that's what I've got from the person who posed this to me last Wednesday. So at any rate, that is, excuse me again. All right, so what we'll do here is, let me see if we have any questions, and then I will, all right, so Andrew says, Robert, I don't know if you answered this last time. Can you explain how GPS satellites prove or disprove relativity? Yeah, I did do it last time, Andrew. I spent quite a long time on it. Where were you? I probably spent about between 5 and 10 minutes on that very question. So what I would suggest is that you go back, because we have the recording of the first program on this Facebook page. So go back there and look at that. I can't tell you when that question was asked, what part of the program it was asked, but I know it's there. So check that out for me. Okay, Gage says, is there a difference between the faith one often receives before baptism, he believes in Christ and the truths of the faith, and the gift of the theological virtue of faith received in baptism that is poured into his heart, along with hope and charity? Well, on a supernatural level, yeah, there's a big difference, okay, because baptism, the faith we have for baptism infuses faith, hope, and love in us, in our souls. Now, we don't see it happening, of course. We believe that event happens by faith. I mean, it happens because we believe it happens, right? Like when we baptize a baby, we don't see, cloud of God going in the baby and infusing them with virtues. These are all basically abstract as far as we're concerned. They're just abstract, but they're not abstract as far as God is concerned. They're real. They're real. And as Thomas talked about the soul, he says in baptism, the quality of the soul is changed. Okay, so the substance of the soul is changed. Now here again, we're talking about a spiritual thing. I mean, what's a soul? I couldn't tell you. Okay, I know I have one because Revelation tells me. They say that my soul animates my body. I'm not too sure about that, but I do know that the soul is a vital part of my person, Robert SUNGENIS, whoever that is. Okay, I have a spirit and a body component into one being. But my soul, as the church teaches us, is infused with these theological virtues, and they're real. Okay, it's not fictitious like in the Protestant. You know, we have sin and there's this covering so that, but it's not a real covering. Okay, it's just an abstract idea they have that God's not going to look at us in the same way he did before, because Christ is supposed to cover the sin part of us. But the fact is, the sin's still there, and it's just covered over. In Catholicism, the sin's taken out, and the quality of the soul is rebuilt, so to speak. Okay, so that's important. So when that faith comes in, that's a lot different than the faith we have prior. Now, the Council of Trent dealt a little bit with this issue that you bring up, not directly, but indirectly. In session 6, chapter 4 and 5, before they get to the big chapters about justification, 6, 7, and 8. You'll read in chapters 4 and 5 at the Council of Trent, session 6, you can find this in Denzinger, that God gives the non-Christian the ability to believe that God exists. Okay? And that's a faith. Okay? That's a belief that the man has, that God exists. All right? Now, often we say that, you know, as the church teaches us, we can reason out that God exists by seeing, but it's more than that. It's more than just our reasoning. God actually gives a grace, what we call prevenient grace, so that we can take what we see in the creation and then reason out, with the help of prevenient grace, that God exists and that we are responsible to him. Okay? So that's what that chapter says. But of course, that faith is a lot different than the faith we're going to receive at baptism. Okay? It's much more intense at baptism. If you're an adult, that is, it's going to be much more intense. Okay? Because you just received a sacrament. And that sacrament has power. Okay? Now, the thing about sacraments is, though they do their job, I mean, you receive baptism by faith. So that is, you, as a candidate, you believe in the church, and that prevenient grace has brought you to that point. And now you tell the church, now I want to receive the sacrament, and that's going to infuse a greater faith in me, greater love than I had before I was a non-Christian, or when I was a non-Christian man, and hope as well. Okay, infused. So I think I've answered your question, and I'm just trying to see if there's anything around the edges I need to deal with. But it's a good question, because it brings up this whole thing about what does baptism do for us? For us as Catholics, as opposed to a lot of Protestants, like James White. All James White's baptism does is get him wet. Okay? Doesn't do anything for him, and he doesn't believe it does anything for him. To him, it's just a symbol. A symbol that he's already believed in Jesus, and so now we get doused with water to sort of tell everybody I believe now. Okay? That's what most of your Protestant denominations hold for baptism. The only ones that are different are the Lutherans and the Anglicans. And they got that capital from the Catholic Church because they were very close to the Catholic Church in history at that time. And they kept a lot of the beliefs from the Catholic Church. They got rid of the papacy, of course, because that got in the way of other things they wanted to do. But the sacraments, you know, they kept most of those. And so that's why you can hardly tell the difference sometimes between the Anglicans and the Catholics. As a matter of fact, I think they call their service the Mass. They go to the Mass. I heard one news commentator talking about that the other day, that the Anglicans were going to their Mass. You know, and they got various understandings about the Eucharist, of course, that are a little different than ours. Well, maybe a lot different because there's only one transubstantiation. At any rate, I think I've answered that question, so let me go on. If I don't get your question tonight, just save it till next time. Okay, Ahmed says, I feel like I'm deja vu here. He says, the gravitational waves, does it prove relativity? No. I think we covered this last time. Somebody was asking about a black hole. Was it you, Ahmed? You're asking about black holes? All right, so let me deal a little bit science-y here with this question. First of all, you know, gravitational waves is another product of Einstein's general relativity. It's a mathematical product. So we don't know whether gravitational waves exist. That's just a theory, okay? Now, general relativity has been pointing to gravitational waves for a few decades now, and they've tried to find proof of it. And, you know, that's a difficult task, basically. So what they did was a couple of years ago, they had this machine built. Well, that machine was built probably 10 years prior. The LIGO machine, L-I-G-O, laser something, okay? And it was built just like a Michelson-Morley interferometer with, you had, you can't see my hands, but it was like the important elements were in a crisscross pattern, and they were going to detect whether they saw a gravitational wave, because the wave, if it came from these black holes, you know, what was it, 165 million years ago? I mean, that in itself is just funny that they would say these black holes are 165 million light years away, or whatever distance it was. And we just happened to have the machines on at the right time for them to feel this gravitational wave go by when these two black holes supposedly merged. So in other words, what they're saying is the black holes merged, they sent out a gravitational wave 165 million years ago, and it finally reached us. And it reached us at the right time that we just invented the LIGO machine to capture it, okay? So, and then you go into, well, how to know that captured it? Well, we saw this blip on our radar, so to speak. And where did that blip come from? Well, we checked everything else, and you know, we couldn't find out where this blip was coming from. So it must be coming from this gravitational wave. That's the thinking they used. This paper was written by MIT scientists. Okay, we've taken out all the other possibilities we think it could be, and so we're only left with one: the gravitational wave. Okay, so that's their proof that the gravitational wave exists. All right, and then when you look at the interferometer, or the laser interferometer they use, and the principle behind it, the way it's supposed to work is you have the gravitational wave coming in, it hits the one of the tunnels where the laser beam is being shot through, and the gravitational wave is supposed to shorten the tunnel, and if that's the case, then the laser beam that shot through it is supposed to be able to go through it faster because the tunnel is shorter. That's the principle behind it, okay? Now, they can't measure if the tunnel shortened, because they don't have anything sensitive enough to measure it. And you ask them, well, why? And they say, because it only decreased by the length of a proton. Okay? Why do they say that? Well, because the blip they see on the radar, their instrumentation, has to coincide with the length of a proton, because that's all they saw for the difference. So the whole thing is just cockamamie. I mean, it's one hypothetical thing leading to another hypothetical thing. And all because, I've said this many times, so it's to keep Einstein propped up in the realm of physics and the world as the greatest scientist in the world. Okay? And because you can just say there's gravitational waves for so long until somebody says, no, wait a minute, come on. Where's the proof of this? Because if we don't have the proof of this, then we can't go on to the next advance in science. We have to have building blocks here. So we need to know whether this is true or not. And so they went through this whole thing. And, you know, I'm not the only one saying this. You can find a plethora of papers on the internet critiquing this LIGO experiment that they had that supposedly found gravitational waves. Okay? So, you know, I could say a lot more, but I think it's enough for now. So let me see what else we have here. Renee says, hello, Robert. Thank you for doing this. God bless you. Well, thank you, Renee. And please pray for me that I can continue doing it as long as I'm healthy and alive. Because I love to do it. I love to teach people about God, and it's my life, you know, it's what I do. Anyway, I could go on and on about that, but okay. Ben Emerson says, oh, I'm sorry, I used your last name. Ben says, hello, Robert. Is it safe to say that the Catholic Church infallibly teaches that the earth is a sphere, given that there is a consensus of the Church Fathers that teach that? Well, Ben, I would be inclined to say so, except I'm very careful about that because only the magisterium can really say whether the magisterium was infallible on a given issue, okay? I mean, I get this question a lot with the Galileo issue as well. And by the way, as an advertisement, I just made another video, and the title of it is called The Status of the Anti-Copernican Decrees of the Catholic Church. I put it up on YouTube yesterday, and it's about an hour and 37 minutes. So I go through some detail there. You can imagine an hour and 37 minutes. Everything from the Fathers, the Council of Trent Catechism, which teaches geocentrism, Pius V, Urban VIII, and the Trial of Galileo, the Index of Forbidden Books, Alexander VII, the imprimatur that was given to Canon Satelli in 1821, the taking off of Galileo's and Copernicus's names from the Index of 1835 under Gregory XVI. I deal with Newton and how the Catholic Church edited his book and put a disclaimer on it saying that the pontiffs teach geocentrism and Newton doesn't. That's a rather interesting turn in history there. And I deal with Benedict XIV and his Index of Forbidden Books in the 1700s. Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, and I deal with John Paul II's speech in 1992. And very briefly, because I only have to make a few comments and just put that thing to bed. And then I deal with Cardinal Ratzinger's statement in 1990 in the speech he gave in Parma, Italy, saying that it's impossible to say that the popes were wrong in condemning Heliocentrism because of the nature of relativity. He came right out and said it. So cover all that in there. Now, what I was saying was I get the same question about, oh, so I do cover this issue of infallibility, papal infallibility, and ordinary magisterium infallibility. I deal with those two issues in this new video. So you could probably get a lot of answers there. But the reason I bring this up is that people often ask whether the decrees against Copernicanism that were given in 1616 and 1633 are infallible. Okay. My first answer is, well, they have all the criterion of infallibility, papal infallibility. There's 4 criteria for papal infallibility. Every one of them is fulfilled by these 2 popes. Okay. But even then, I have no right to claim that they are infallible because only the magisterium does. So one day, I would hope, and I think the 1992 speech was the first leg of this, and there's going to be many more to come if we survive, where they will be talking about Galileo again. And a decision will have to be made as to whether these decrees were infallible or not. Now, see, the problem with infallibility is it was one thing to give us the doctrine in 1870, and that's a blessing for the church. Some people didn't think so at the time, but I think it is a blessing for the church because, wow, that puts us right where Jesus wanted us when he gave those words to Peter in Matthew 16, 18, and 19. You know, I've always said that, you know, when Jesus said to Peter, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose shall be loosed in heaven. I mean, think about what those words mean. This is Peter, the Pope, given the keys of the kingdom. He's the only one given the keys of the kingdom. And he said, whatever you bind, Peter, singly, you in the Greek is singular, so it's you, Peter, whatever you, Peter, bind, heaven will also bind. Well, that's interesting. I don't know anybody in heaven who lies or tells a falsehood, do you? So if heaven binds what Peter binds, that means what Peter binds must be the truth. And not only the truth, it must be an infallible truth. Otherwise, heaven couldn't bind it. If it had any falsity in it, heaven could not bind it. So that in itself, I wrote about this 20 years ago. Okay, now somebody would say to me, well, but not everything the Pope says is infallible. Well, of course. But Jesus already covered that in the passage. He said, whatsoever you choose, okay, to bind or loose is bound or loose, and heaven will back you up. So the popes have said, well, not everything, the popes themselves have said, not everything I say is infallible. Okay, so they're choosing which things they say are infallible. So they're covered there. So that Greek phrase ho aeon, which is translated whatsoever, means whatsoever they deem as infallible and bind it or loose it will be considered the same in heaven. And heaven can't lie. Okay? So that infallibility, wow, that's what Jesus taught from the beginning. Okay? He would be with the church to guide them into all truth. How are you going to have that if you're not infallible on these very doctrines? Okay, and that's where the Pope says, when I speak of doctrine, I am speaking infallibly, okay, basically. But still then, the church herself has to tell us which one of these decrees in the past is infallible. I mean, we have all kinds of people guessing in the Catholic Church, well, this must be infallible because it seems like it follows all, or this must be infallible and this is not infallible. Well, and they do the same thing with the Galileo issue. I'll say, well, that can't be infallible. Well, how do you know that? When I look at it, I see it fulfills all the criteria, but I'm not going to say it's not possible that it's infallible, because it is possible if the criteria are fulfilled. The only thing is I don't have the authority to say so because I'm not the magisterium. You know, I wish the church would set aside a council to go back through history and tell us which decrees are infallible, from the Pope especially. Okay, I mean, we had a big hullabaloo going on with Pope Honorius back there in the 5th century. And they all came out and said that, you know, Honorius's letter to Sergius that Christ only had one will was heretical. But they said because he didn't say that in the forum required for papal infallibility, and that's interesting because that hadn't been defined yet. It wouldn't be defined until 1,500 years later at 1870. But they all had the sense of what was infallible and what wasn't, you see. And so that's what the tradition gives us, that yes, they knew in their heart of hearts that there was a distinction between what the Pope said off the cuff, so to speak, and what he said as a doctrinal decree. Now, the other issue about the Galileo thing is some people say, well, that's not an issue about heresy, that's just an issue about discipline. Galileo was disciplined by the church. No. I mean, Galileo was convicted of being suspected of heresy. And you can't be convicted of being suspect of heresy unless the heresy has already been declared and defined, you see. So that makes it a matter of heresy, thus a matter of doctrine, thus a matter for the universal church. And that's why both Paul V and Urban VIII sent out letters to all the papal nuncios, all the universities, all the mathematicians, everybody across Europe and the environs of the Catholic Church, and told them about what the church had decided about Galileo, and that they were committed and obligated to obey it. And they wanted an answer right away whether they were going to obey it. And if they didn't answer right away, Cardinal Barberini got on their case and said, I want your answer pronto. That's how serious the church was about this thing. Okay, so here you have an area of doctrine that the Pope is requiring the universal church to believe and hold as truth. Okay, so again, you can see why I see the criteria there. It's all fulfilled because one of the criteria for papal infallibility is that the doctrine has to be disseminated to the universal church. It has to be taught as a doctrine to the universal church, which it was. Okay, and again, you can't. It's not a matter of discipline; it's a matter of heresy. So I mean, we got a pretty serious issue here. Pretty serious issue that the church needs to revisit, and not with the idea. See, they revisited in 1981 with the Studia Galilea, which was organized by John Paul II, but they all went in there with the idea that Galileo was right and the church was wrong. Okay, because they've been in that mist for how many years now, ever since Newton came along. The church has trembled at Newtonian laws and succumbed to, well, maybe we were wrong, maybe the Holy Spirit wasn't there, and blah blah blah. Or else they try to say it's not a matter of heresy, it's just a discipline. Then we can just sweep it under the rug, like what's his name does from Catholic Answers, Christopher Check. He does that with this issue. At any rate, I hope I've answered your question. So the answer to the Earth as a sphere would be yes, I think it's tending toward infallibility, but not as strong as the Galileo issue. Okay, because we didn't have Galileos in the flat Earth issue. I mean, we had Father Foscarini, who came a year before Galileo. He wrote a book defending heliocentrism as fact. Okay, Galileo came and wrote letters to various people treating heliocentrism as fact. Zuniga came along. And then, of course, there was Copernicus. His was a little bit more, politically written. But even he had problems. And even Protestants had problems. Like Kepler, he was put on the index. So we had 5 guys within like a year or 2 of each other, all writing, pro-heliocentric books. And the church had to deal with it. It was sitting right in their lap. And people were being influenced by these top theologians and mathematicians. But that didn't occur for the flat earth theory. Okay, there wasn't anybody standing up in the Middle Ages and saying, the earth is flat, and then writing a book about it and calling it fact. Okay, nothing like that happened in the church. Everybody believed that the earth was a sphere. Now, the only one, maybe 1 or 2, depends on how you read some of these guys. Lactantius was the only one who, he said the earth wasn't spherical. He never said it was flat, though. If you want to get technical. What he had a problem with was the antipodes. The antipodes idea was that if you have a spherical earth, then those that are in Antarctica, so to speak, are standing upside down because their feet are, up and their head is down if you look at up and down in that way, okay? So he said on a flat earth, they would be straight up. Now, the reason he was so concerned about that was that he says, the Lord made man upright. Okay? Now, I would be the first one to say, Lactantius, you're a good guy, but come on. Upright here does not mean physical, all right? He's talking about he made him without sin, as Adam and Eve were made without sin. He made him upright, and then he fell. That's what the passage is talking about. All right, every one of us has our little, things where we go off the beaten path. So he didn't have to really be concerned about that. And I think if somebody had answered him correctly, he would have gotten off this kick that the earth isn't spherical. Okay, so he was the only one, but he was quiet. He was a quiet voice in the early fathers, all right? So now the question I think you're asking, though, is since the fathers believe this in consensus, is it considered infallible? Well, let's put it this way. It's high on the candidate list of being infallible, and ostensibly, yes, it is infallible. But see, again, we're not the judges. The church has to determine whether that consensus is valid, whether it persists, who were those that composed the consensus. All those questions have to be answered. The church is busy enough doing other things. This is not a high priority on their list, okay? The Galileo issue is a high priority because basically the church has been beaten up with this issue of Galileo for the last, 400 years? I mean, if you haven't heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times. Oh, the Catholic Church thinks it's infallible. But what about Galileo? It sticks out like a sore thumb in the Catholic Church. And everybody that tries to claim authority for the Catholic Church, the opponent will go back to, go back to Galileo and say, well, what happened in the Galileo case? Was the Holy Spirit asleep? On vacation? You say the Holy Spirit's with you to lead you in all truth. Well, what happened? Well, some Catholics, it's not really doctrine, so to speak. We just had to deal with that issue and, put it quietly to bed. And hope it wouldn't raise its ugly head again. I, on the other hand, don't look at it that way. And I think God has led me in that direction. It was a heresy. The church was led by the Holy Spirit. Was not on vacation. And the easiest way to defend the Catholic Church is to say she was right. she was right. Okay? There was no time where the Holy Spirit was not guiding the church into all truth. Not just some truth, all truth. And apparently, according to Paul V and Robert Bellarmine, who was the head of the Inquisition, it is a matter of faith because it's a matter of the inerrancy of Scripture. So, all the bases are covered there. And this is why it's a very serious issue. It's why I spent the last 16 years on this issue, looking into every nook and cranny that I could. And my position remains the same. And I believe someday the church will revisit this with a whole different look, especially after what Cardinal Ratzinger had said about science not being able to discredit geocentrism because of the nature of relativity. So look at my video. I think you'll find it informative. And anyway, let's go on here. Excuse me. Kate, I think I know what you're saying, but JQ. Kate says, I love how you weren't afraid to address the JQ long before others did. Hero, exclamation point. Well, thank you, Kate. Appreciate your, I think I know what you're talking about. But if you don't put the exact issue down there, then I won't talk about it. If you want to come in again and tell me what JQ is, I'll be glad to talk about it. Okay. Wow, I've never seen that first name before. Jabernson? Jabernson, okay. Any chance you write a book on biblical theology and on Mary? That's a good question. Someday I'd like to write a book on Mary, but I am just so burnt out writing books. That's why, I decided to come on Facebook, because if I get my head in the book again, I may get stuck there and won't be able to talk to you. So the answer right now would be no. The answer in the future may be yes, but I'm getting old, as you can tell. How long the Lord has for me, I don't know, but I've definitely considered Mary. I mean, I've written a lot about Mary so far. I had a debate with, who was it? Some famous Protestant, I forget his name. 2 or 3 years ago, and that was on the Assumption of Mary. And it was a good debate. And that's on YouTube, I believe. You can find it. And I've wanted to do a debate on the Immaculate Conception and other perpetual virginity of Mary, because I put a lot of work into those topics when I was writing the Catholic Apologetic Study Bible. And yeah, what I could do is I just could, get all that material I've already written and put it into a book. But then I won't be satisfied with that. I'll have to go into every other little nook and cranny, because I know how my mind works. And if I don't cover it, then I'll just think the work is incomplete and always be bothered by it. So, yeah, I don't know what to tell you, Jamerson. So, okay. Kate says, do you agree? See, we got about 10 minutes left for tonight. And before we leave, let me, if you weren't here in the beginning, I'm still thinking about the days I want to do this. And I'm thinking of doing it 2 days during the week. That's about, all the time I can afford. And maybe Tuesday and Thursday, or maybe Tuesday and Wednesday, or Wednesday and Thursday. So if you don't hear from me on Facebook between now and Wednesday, you can count on me being here next Wednesday. And if I'm here Wednesday, but I wasn't here Tuesday, then I'll be here Thursday also. Okay, so. Kate says, do you agree with your friend and co-author John Salza that we can't think Pope Francis isn't Pope due to not being properly elected, or because Benedict never fully resigned, or because Francis is a heretic, or for any reasonable reason? Well, I have said this from the beginning, whether it was John Paul II or Benedict XVI or now Francis I, that we do not have the authority to declare the Pope a heretic. We don't have the authority to depose him. We just have no such authority. We're just little parishioners. You know, we're nothing. You know, they are the magisterium. And as Catholics, we must respect the magisterium. It may be from the pit of hell, or populated by those from the pit of hell, as we see evidence of. We may have, you know, a real flaming heretic in the papacy, okay? The best we can do is complain about it. We have that right. We have that right to point out to our pastors what we see with the gifts God has given us, with the intelligence God has given us, with the knowledge that he's given us. We have that right to tell them how we feel, okay? But that's as far as it goes. We cannot make decisions based on what we think, okay? Otherwise, we're Protestants. We are Catholics. We hold to the hierarchy of the church, good, bad, or indifferent. Okay, it's just like getting married. It says for better or worse, for richer or poorer, till death do you part. And in that case, it's talking about the death of the Pope. Okay, we're married to the church, and we stay. The minute we find ourselves saying the Pope is not a Pope, we've crossed the line. Okay, now we can teach our children, okay, because we're responsible for their education, and we can warn them. You know, we have trouble. Me and Mom have trouble believing this guy's for real. But we are Catholics, and that's as far as this discussion goes. Okay, I'm not going to go out and preach to my neighbors, Catholic neighbors, well, you know, he's not really the Pope. No, that's not our prerogative. You go in that direction, you will be judged by God. That is my opinion. Okay. Look, this, wherever he came from, whatever he's doing, this too shall pass. Okay. I'm, 64 years old. I've been through 7, 8 popes, 9 popes. They come and they go. They're here for God's purpose, and then they're gone. Okay? And, man, there are times I could have, in my mind, deposed them all because of some things they said or did. Okay? We're going to have imperfect men. Peter was imperfect. I mean, the Bible gave us a clue about what kind of men we were going to have in office at times. Not that all are bad. Okay? There are many good popes. Most of them are good. But at times we're going to get some real winners in there, and losers. And we let time pass. Okay? Let time pass. Let God guide his church. He will do it. And I just refuse to get upset about it. I really do. I'm just going to keep on doing what I've been doing. All right? And that's what we're doing right now. Okay? And thank God for that. All right? So, yeah, so I do agree with John. Okay? I think I'm the one who told John that. And we both agreed on it. So, anyway, let me move on here. Gage says, regarding, so we got 5 minutes left. Regarding Hebrews 10:29, Protestant John Piper says, they feel the blowing of God's Spirit of grace and taste his wooing and winning influences. And in all this, they are visibly set apart from the world, sanctified the way the people of Israel were. Sanctified the way the people of Israel was sanctified among the nations, even though many of them were faithless. In other words, they are set apart to hear the gospel and take part in the visible church, but are not sanctified inwardly by the blood of Christ. How would you respond to that interpretation, trying to say that those sanctified are not true believers, which differs from James White's interpretation? I would say the same thing I've said to the Protestants who try to do the same with other verses. You know, you can minimize the Greek words until you're content that you forced your doctrine into the verse. And that's what he's doing with the word sanctified. Now it becomes a corporate sanctification. That's what he's talking about here, okay? Corporate sanctification. But I don't see any context of corporateness in Hebrews at all. This writer is dealing with them as an individual. You as an individual, if you leave Christianity and go to Judaism, this is what you will suffer, okay? That's not corporate. Now, you could give a corporate warning like that. Israel was given corporate warnings by Moses, you know, when he gave the 10 Commandments, or, you know, when he talked to them as an assembly, okay? But this passage is talking to the individual Hebrew Christian. And the word sanctified in Hebrews, I think it's used probably half a dozen times, is never used corporately. It's always used to the individual that's been sanctified or is being sanctified, okay? So Mr. Piper can read into Hebrews 10:29 anything he wants. And what he's going to read into it is the definitions he needs to support the conclusion that he already came to the verse with, okay? And that is, these can't be true Christians that are being talked about here. But I don't know anywhere in Hebrews where the writer speaks to them as if they're not true Christians, okay? So it's just like a vicious circle these people are in. And it's like a dog chasing its tail. They're never going to catch it because they can't prove the definitions of the words they're trying to put into the verse. Okay, so somebody has a remedy for my sore throat, which is boil a crushed ginger for 10 minutes. Let it warm and drink it. It's a solution for the voice. Okay, I will have that next time. Crushed ginger, okay? Boil it for 10 minutes. What's the active ingredient? That's what I'd like to know. All right, so maybe we have time for one more. Let me see what we got here. Jonathan says, hi, Robert, can you address the Diamond Brothers and where they err on Sedevacantism? Important for traditional Catholics to address. Well, Jonathan, I think I just addressed it. So I was ahead of your question. You know, the line that they have crossed is that they are now proclaiming that Francis is not the Pope or that John Paul II wasn't the Pope, blah, 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 blah. So they've gotten themselves into very deep water, okay? I would not even talk to them. Don't even bother listening or talking to them, okay? Otherwise, you may find yourself on the same side of the fence. They're very clever, but they have no authority. That is the bottom line. It's very easy to answer this Sedevacantism question. We have no authority to judge the Pope. Okay, period, end of story. You can have all the opinions you want, and you can even live by those opinions, because your conscience has to be satisfied. But when you go out and preach it to others as if you're the authority now, and you've got the truth, without that being verified by the magisterium, you've left the faith, basically. Okay, so that's how strong I am on that issue. And like I said, this too shall pass. This too shall pass. You maintain your own Christian faith. Don't worry about what somebody else is doing. Okay? Keep your eyes on yourself. Make yourself obedient to everything that you've been taught by the church. That's is truth, and is doctrine. Okay? And that's all you need to do, and your children as well. Okay. Patrick says, speak on the Diamond Brothers. We just did. Bob says, would the Foucault pendulum operate the same way, whether the Earth is stationary or rotating? Thank you. And the answer to that is yes. You see, that's what this whole relativity thing is about. And this is, gosh darn it, I'm going to go on for 5 more minutes here. This is the whole, this Foucault pendulum is the gist of the whole issue, because what it tells us is, and Einstein said this himself, okay? Einstein said the Foucault pendulum would swing around in 24 hours, whether the Earth was rotating in a fixed universe or the universe was rotating around a fixed Earth. That's Einstein. Okay? So he wasn't all that bad. Mach before him said that. And every scientist, physicist worth his salt today would say the same thing. Every one of them. Okay? Why? Because that's the nature of relativity. As far as dynamic forces are concerned, there's no difference between an Earth fixed and a rotating universe and a fixed universe with a rotating Earth. They're the same, identical. Okay. Now the important thing about this is, well, if that's the case, what force in a rotating universe is causing that pendulum to go around in 24 hours? If you live, let's say, in the northern hemisphere, what's causing it is the Coriolis force. Okay, and that's one of the forces you get from the angular momentum of a rotating universe, Coriolis force. And it's an interesting little force, because you would think a rotating universe having to put up with centrifugal force would be tough to do. You've all been on one of those amusement rides, or you let your kids go on them, where you have this whirling bin, and the kids go in there and they're stuck to the wall of the rotating bin, and they can't get off no matter how hard they try until the ride stops. Well, that's the centrifugal force that's holding them there. Okay, and then so that would tend to make everything go to the outside. So if the universe is rotating, you have stars in the universe, and they would be forced to the rim of the universe if the universe was rotating because of the centrifugal force. Okay? And a lot of people raise that objection. How can you have a geocentric universe if the centrifugal force is going to make all these stars go out to the rim? You notice have a big mass of white light at the rim of the universe. Well, that's not true. Okay? The second force that's caused by a rotating universe is the Coriolis force. Again, right from Albert Einstein and all the scientists that believe in relativity. Okay? Now, what is the Coriolis force? Well, Coriolis force is twice as strong as the centrifugal force. And you can look that up in Wikipedia. And I quote Wikipedia in my books, so everybody knows where to get it. And the centrifugal force is an inward circular force. okay? It's a really strange force. And because it's twice the magnitude of its centrifugal force, it counteracts the centrifugal force. So much so that those stars are going to stay right in the same position that they started in because of the Coriolis force, okay? So the rotating universe works. Einstein knew it worked. As a matter of fact, Einstein said that in a rotating universe, the speed of light is not c. It's not constant. That it increases the farther out you go from the Earth. Because there, the inertial forces are much greater than they are on the surface of the Earth, where that Foucault pendulum is made to go around. See, we have a residual amount of those inertial forces that make that Foucault pendulum go around on the surface of the Earth. The Coriolis force we know exists because it makes the hurricanes go counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern hemisphere. How much of a force has there to be? And this is just the residual end of the Coriolis force in the universe. How much strength must that Coriolis force have in order to make that hurricane turn left or right, two different directions in the northern and southern hemisphere? It's got to be pretty strong, especially when it's just a residual part that we feel on Earth, which is practically nothing compared to what's out in the universe. Okay, so this is the essence of a geocentric universe. You have these two forces that are holding everything in place and allow the universe to remain just as you see it every night in the sky because of these two essential forces. There's actually one more, the Euler force, but that's not important right now. Okay, so I wanted to go off on that tangent, and thank you for asking that question about the Foucault pendulum, because that allowed me to go off on that tangent, because this is the essence of geocentrism, and it's so simple, okay? Just one more thing. With Newton, what did he do with these inertial forces, the centrifugal and the Coriolis force? Well, you see, Newton, what he did was he made the universe fixed, and he said it couldn't move, could never move. Why? Because he made it infinite. He made it infinite because he would have had other problems if he didn't have an infinite universe. And an infinite universe can't rotate. And he called this absolute space. That's absolute because it doesn't move. Okay? So now this is what Cardinal Ratzinger touches on in his speech in 1990, this pro-geocentric speech. He says, look, we used to go by Newton and his absolute space, but we don't do that anymore. We go by relativity. Everything's in relative motion. And why was this absolute space so important to Newton? Well, because if you have an absolute space, then the Earth has to move. Okay? It has to revolve and it has to rotate. Because the universe isn't going to do it for you. It can't move. Okay? So he was forced to find equations that satisfied that universe he created. A universe that couldn't rotate, couldn't move, and an Earth that had to move. That's what his equations do. Unfortunately, his equations do not include the inertial forces, centrifugal and Coriolis. They're just not part of his equations. But you know what? When they send satellites up to go around the Earth, or they send probes to Mars or whatever, what do they have to do? They have to add in these centrifugal and Coriolis forces. Otherwise, that probe won't get to Mars. And that satellite won't go around the Earth. See, so they have to add them in by hand, but Newton's original equations didn't have them. So what did he do with them? He says, well, they're just fictitious forces. They just occur, but they just seem to occur to us because the Earth is moving. Okay? Mach and Einstein came along and said, no, can't do that. Can't do that. You can't arbitrarily say that the universe is absolute. How do you know? Okay? So they proceeded to invent a whole physics based on the fact that the universe could move, that it could rotate, instead of the Earth rotating. And that's why it's relative, you see. Because basically, both systems are the same, except that in Newton's system, he doesn't know what to do with the centrifugal and Coriolis forces, but in the geocentric system, they're the very forces that keep all the celestial bodies where they are and allow them to rotate around a fixed Earth. Okay? So there's the mathematics. Everybody's like, where's the math about geocentric? There it is, right there. Okay? They put it in my, this is funny too, because I put it in my latest video called The Fool on the Hill. And I put all the equations in there based on the geocentric universe rotating with the centrifugal and Coriolis forces and all that. And I had this physicist come along and say, you don't have any equations for your geocentric universe. And I know you don't, because they must be very complicated. You know? And here the equations were right in the movie. And then I said, did you watch the movie? No, I didn't watch it. What movie are you talking about? You know, and so anyway, to satisfy my critics who wanted to know, where are the equations? Well, the equations are there, okay? And they're very simple equations. As a matter of fact, I got them from Wikipedia. How do you like that? Yep, Wikipedia. You wouldn't know it, would you? But yeah, underneath it all, they have a geocentric universe. They won't use the word geocentrism there, but they know that's what it leads to. Anyway, I'm going off on another tangent here. So I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. My voice seemed to come back a little bit from where it was. Sometimes it does that. But I will see you again next Wednesday, which would be the 21st for sure. Okay, and if I'm going to see you Tuesday, then I will put a message up on my Facebook page that I'll be there on Tuesday. And if you don't see me on Tuesday, you will see me on Wednesday and Thursday. Okay, that's the most I can do. I'll go through these questions here, and I'll see if I can open the show on next Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday with answering these questions, because I hate for you to write in and me not have the time to answer them. But I must say that once I get on a question, I want to make sure that I answer it and that I just don't, gloss it, and then you're not satisfied and I'm not satisfied. I don't want to walk away from one question. So I do methodically go through these questions, and I do take my time. That's just, the way I do things. At any rate, it was nice being with you, and I look forward to having another session with you next week. Okay? Take care. I will sign off now.